I'm going to start this video with a mental exercise. So go ahead and clear your head, take a deep breath, let all your thoughts flitter away, and I would like you to not think of an elephant. And I'm being serious about that. Nothing even closely related to elephants. So not the traditional elephant with the four legs and the tusks, not the circus elephant that does a bunch of tricks, not the cute little baby elephant that you see in cartoon shows, not even the logo of the Republican Party. So any representation of an elephant, I want you to push out of your head. And most likely you found this a particularly difficult exercise, and there are a couple reasons for that. One, of course, is because I was throwing a bunch of images of elephants on the screen, and so you see an elephant, you're going to think of an elephant. That's kind of obvious, right? But the other has to do with language and how it operates. So the moment I use the term elephant, the concept of an elephant floods into your head, and not just the concept, but all the sort of metaphorical associations that are related to it. So you might have thought of the circus, you might have thought of cartoons or a stuffed animal you had when you were a kid. Some of you might have even thought of the Republican Party. All that stuff is sort of subconsciously lurking in the back of your head. And this is an idea that George Lakoff in his book, Don't Think of an Elephant, describes as framing, right? And his goal in this book is to take the idea of framing and apply it to the media and the political sphere, right? And of course, this is really important for you because your next assignment asks you to look at how the media frame a particular issue. So you got to take a body of text, whether it be social media posts or television shows, or maybe the discussion surrounding a particular movie, right? So you got to take that body of text, and then you have to look how they frame a particular topic, right? Whether it be representations of a particular social group, or maybe an argument related to a political topic, or something along those lines, right? So that's your goal for the next assignment. So in order for you to successfully complete that task, you got to get to understand the idea of framing pretty well, right? And so that's the goal of this video, is to help you understand that. Now, before we get into it, I want to say a few words about George Lakoff. So he is a famous figure in linguistics. He currently works at UC Berkeley, so right down the street from here. He's done most of his work in either cognitive linguistics or philosophy. And if you're, going into a doctoral program in linguistics, there's a 97.3% chance that you will read something by him at some point, right? Most likely you will read a part of his text, Metaphors We Live By, right? Which is his most famous work. And in that book, he basically shows how metaphors sort of underpin all our linguistic use, right? Even down to like simple things like verbs we use and relational terms and that sort of stuff, right? And hopefully you're seeing a relationship there between the argument he's making here and our good old friend Nietzsche that we visited a couple of weeks ago, right? So anyway, huge figure in the history of linguistics, and I suspect if any of you continue to study this, you will run into him at some point, right? And this particular book I encountered in my youth, right? So this was in 2004. And so I'm just going to give you a little history of a little political history of my background, right? So when I grew up in a conservative town in North Dakota, so Minot, North Dakota, about 30,000 people or something like that. A traditional Catholic household, so we went to church quite often. My parents were like really hugely religious, but the rest of my family definitely was, right? And that influenced me to a significant degree. And I grew up, like a lot of young people, as a libertarian, right? I read Ayn Rand's books. I even won a scholarship before I went to college the first time for writing a piece extolling the virtues of George W. Bush and Elizabeth Dole. And I voted for George W. Bush in the 2000 election. That was my first election, my first chance to vote. I was 20 years old, right? Over as his presidency went on, I gradually became more disillusioned. And for me, the real turning point was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I did a lot of reading about the subject. All the experts I looked at seemed to think that was going to be a big disaster, and I just couldn't understand what the rationale for it was, right? And so by the time 2004 had come around, I had moved out of the state. I had changed my political affiliation, and I would go on to do quite a bit of work for John Kerry's campaign in 2004. So I did some canvassing and some other things, right? And if you know anything about the history of that election, John Kerry lost, right? Which was very disappointing to a lot of Democratic, progressive activists at that particular time period, right? And so we were and here's a picture of me here. This is a position. This is another reason a lot of my views changed as I was working in an inner city school in Phoenix called Glendale High School. And you can see there's me here. I'm the dashing young lad on the side of the screen here. And this is me with an ESL classroom I was working as an instructional assistant in. And honestly, growing up in North Dakota, this is one of my first big encounters with cultural difference, right? So I met a bunch of African American students, I met a bunch of Hispanic students, a lot of Asian students, and it really sort of fundamentally changed my picture of the world, right? So that's another reason why I found myself supporting Kerry in 2004. But anyway, right? The point was, after the election, people were they were trying to figure out what happened. They were looking for a story of why the election went so sour, and George Lakoff kind of stepped in and filled that void, right? And so, Don't Think of an Elephant is a book about how to use language effectively in politics, and at the time, it was hugely influential, right? So Democratic Party activists were virtually handing out copies of this book to their members. Everybody seemed like they were reading it, and everybody had a thought about it. Obviously, it influenced Barack Obama in the subsequent election in 2008, right? And so it's a really important text for a variety of reasons, right? And the argument he makes here is related to this psychological concept he calls frames, right? And what frames are, basically, they're mental structures that shape how we see the world, right? And so when we use a certain linguistic term or a linguistic concept, the idea is that it summons a particular frame, a particular way of thinking about things. And so whenever we're arguing, we need to keep that in mind. We need to take that into account whenever we're structuring an argument, right? And one of his favorite examples is the idea of tax relief, right? Which is a term that you see used both by Republican and Democratic candidates quite frequently, right? And so they'll cut taxes, right? And the argument they'll make is that this is a kind of relief, right? And his argument in this book is that we need to think through what that term relief, what kind of connotations that summons, right? And so if you're relieving something, right, then it's an affliction of some sort, right? It's a heavy load that you're carrying, right? It's a sickness of some sort or something like that, right? And so the relief is freeing you from that particular affliction, right? And so his argument here is that makes us view taxation as a kind of affliction, right? And that works against democratic policy goals, which often require having taxes or raising taxes in order to fund certain social programs, right? And so his argument here is we need to be careful when we use that kind of language if we're a Democratic candidate and we support taxation to achieve certain goals, right? And so he argues that instead we should use other kinds of metaphors. When we talk about taxing, we should help the public view it in a different way, right? One argument he makes that was extremely popular in Democratic circles is that we should use the language of investment, right? And so you should view taxes and investment to help us grow certain social structures and benefit other people down the line, that sort of thing. Another frame that he uses that's been popular at various points in our history is to view taxes kind of like paying your membership dues, right? And this is very similar to the quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. that's on the IRS building, and it's taxes are what we pay for a civilized society, right? And that's kind of arguing for the membership frame, right? So if you want to live in this civilized society, then you got to pay your dues, you got to pay your taxes, right? And so he argues that this kind of language puts us more in the Democrats' turf, right? It's a frame that's more friendly towards the Democratic agenda, right? Now, I want to be really careful about how I describe George Lakoff's argument because he really very much describes Republicans as always being manipulative with language, while Democrats are always upholding the truth and that sort of thing. And of course, that's not completely true. And it is true, of course, that Democrats are often very good at using language to achieve their ends. And a good example of that would be the Dreamers debate, right? So if you've heard of Dreamers, of that group of people, right, that's the term that Democrats often use to describe undocumented children that come to the United States at a very young age, right? Typically, they're raised in the United States, they go to our schools, they very much have our values and our culture, that sort of thing, right? And so the argument that Democrats want to make, right, is that those people deserve a path to citizenship, right? And that's where the Dreamers language comes in, right? And so the argument here is that group of people are dreamers just like the rest of us. They want to uphold the American dream just like any American child wants to, right? They want to grow up and be successful and go to college and do all that sort of stuff, right? And so it's very much a frame that puts dreamers in a category along with the rest of American citizens, right? And you can see that really clearly, the success of that framing with this sign here, where it says, "We are all dreamers," right? We are all striving for the American dream, including this group of people that we're fighting to protect, right? So that's an example where Democrats use framing very effectively to achieve their ends. And also, framing comes in throughout the immigration debate, right? I mean, you can see this really clearly in the debate over whether to use the term illegal or undocumented immigrant, because both these terms invoke different frames, right? So the legal immigrant frame depicts these groups of immigrants as lawbreakers, right? There's a legal process that they could go through. They choose not to do that. They come to the United States illegally and then take advantage of our institutions in whatever way that they choose to do so, right? And so the illegal immigrant frame that puts us in the thinking of legality, right? That's the way we think about this particular issue, right? Well, the undocumented frame puts us in the mindset of viewing these immigrants as just like any other group of immigrants, right? But they just don't have documentations, right? So if we just gave them that sheet of paper, just like you give a college student a college degree or something along those lines, right? Then they would suddenly become documented and this problem would kind of disappear, right? And so viewing it in terms of documentation, of course, is evoking very different frames than viewing it in terms of legality, right? Now, which of these perspectives is true, right? Both of them are, right? Both of them are accurate, right? And so it is accurate to say that immigrants who come across the border without going through the process are doing so illegally, right? It is also accurate to say that if we gave this group of people documentation, right, they would be citizens just like everybody else, right? So really, the point here is that depending on what your policy goals are, you need to use language to achieve them, right? And so if you're supporting of opening up a wider path of citizenship for certain groups of people, the way I am, right, then you are going to want to use the undocumented frame, right? However, if you view people not going through the proper legal procedures, and if you want to keep immigration standards basically the way they currently are, right, then you're going to want to use the illegal immigrant frame, right? And so that's just something to keep in mind, right? When you're making an argument, you want to use language as effectively as you can to achieve whatever goals that you have, right? So that brings us to Emily Martin, right? And hopefully what you're seeing now is that Emily Martin's essay that we read is all about framing, right? The difference here is that she's not applying it to the political sphere necessarily. She's applying it to scientific discourse, right? And just a few facts about her. She's a professor of cultural anthropology at New York University. She works with the anthropology of science, so that's what she's really interested in. And although this essay is probably what she's most known for, she's also known for a book, The Woman in the Body, which looks at an assortment of women's health issues and how they're depicted in scientific publications, right? So that's really what she's known for, right? And in this essay, of course, what she's arguing is that we are importing the frames that we use in popular culture to discuss the human reproductive process, right? And so in the frames we're using, we depict the sperm as the masculine hero, right? That is floating towards the egg and then kissing it almost like you would kiss a sleeping princess to awaken it from its slumber, right? And so in this particular frame, the sperm is what's doing all the acting, right? While the egg is the sort of passive recipient of that action, right? And the problem is she's arguing here is that that's not accurate. That's not true, right? That if we actually look at the biological processes, that we see both the sperm and the egg play an active role, right? And so by thinking of it in these terms, right, we're ignoring all the ways that the egg is crucial to reproduction, and not just the egg, but other reproductive structures, right? And I think that's been borne out by biological research since that point, that we've discovered that the egg definitely, regardless of the species, definitely plays a huge role in reproduction, right? And by the way, when you're looking for sperm hero, you come up with a lot of weird crap. So this is from an article about how UK women are often coming into Danish countries in droves to get sperm from Danish male candidates, right? So apparently UK women really like Danish sperm for whatever reason. So if you're interested in that topic, you're free to look that article up. I only just sort of glanced through the headline. Now, one final thing is I do think it's possible, because this is a traditional sort of rhetorical analysis text, Emily Martin's essay. You might view it as kind of cherry picking, right? Even though I think the examples she uses are very convincing. And so I went to see if there's any subsequent research that's been done on this that looked at the topic in a little more thorough way. And I did find this study that was published in 2014 that was done by a couple sociology researchers. And they use a textual analysis approach, right? So basically, what they did is they looked through biology textbooks, and then they rated those biology textbooks across a variety of dimensions using a standardized rubric, right? There is some limitations to the approach. The readers for the study were themselves, right, which is a problem, right? And also, they didn't have a third reader for issues of disagreement, right? So if there was a disagreement, they just both looked at it together and they came up with a mutual rating, which isn't quite as rigorous as I would like, but I still think you get like a rough snapshot of what's going on here, right? And they evaluated the textbooks along 3 criteria, right? So one is structure, where they were looking at like use of passive voice to describe female anatomy or the egg or whatever, and information, whether they were privileging, this description of the sperm's journey versus the egg's journey, or whether there was misinformation about the two, that sort of thing. And neutrality, whether there was like unnecessary commentary or gendered language or whatever. And as you can see in the textbooks they look at, which included those from medical school and middle school and so on and so forth, you will still see there seems to be a problem here. That there seems to be a lot of problematic gendered language used throughout the text, right? And so that's moderately convincing to me. I'd have to look to see if there's even a more authoritative study that was done on the subject, but there is at least some empirical support for the hypothesis Emily Martin's making here, right? So anyway, right? So hopefully this gives you a sense of what I want you to do with your next paper, right? So your goal is to look at a body of media text, just like Emily Martin did within The Sperm and the Egg, right? And so in her case, it was scientific discourse. In your case, it could be whatever you want. And I think social media is a good candidate, right, to go onto Twitter or Reddit or something along those lines. But I think a television show would work too. I had one project last year where a student looked at the media response to a movie, right? And that was pretty interesting, right? And then basically your goal is to look at how the media is framing a particular topic, right? And you can choose whatever you want. It could be something about economics. It could be, and one student who did something about psychological therapy. It's really up to you what topic you want to look at, right? And so use Emily and Martin's essay here as your model. You want to do something fairly similar to what she did in this text, although, of course, given that you only have like 3 weeks, it's going to be a little less rigorous, right? All right, so if there are any questions about that, go ahead and email me. And then on Wednesday, or on Friday, I'm sorry, we're going to talk about library research. So I'm going to give you some hints and tricks that I've developed through a decade's worth of academic research that might help you a little bit find articles on your subject, right? So anyway, I will see you later.